Welcome back. The other day I talked about my Model 41 Smith & Wesson. Well, you know, there's another 41, and it's a very favorite of mine, though I don't own one right now. And it's not a Model 41, it's the 41 Smith & Wesson Magnum. It's a cartridge that you may not have heard of. It's a cartridge that many people have neither heard of, or maybe if they've heard of it, they couldn't care less because they don't know much about it. All they know is that it's not, most people know it to be a cartridge that's not very popular. In fact, some people have gone so far to say that it shouldn't exist, that there's no particular rhyme or reason for it. Well, I'm going to talk about the 41 Smith & Wesson Magnum because I think it's one of the finest handgun cartridges that was ever devised for the handgun hunter. I'm going to also talk about the many pitfalls that it succumbed to, and it's been basically dying on the vine ever since its release. It was produced by Smith & Wesson, kind of at the, I would say it was a little bit more than encouragement, it was more or less coercion by a typewriter. Two individuals who were quite well known at the time, and one is still to this day, Duke Roberts, who wrote for Gun World, and the inimitable Elmer Keith, a big bore fan, man of the who spanned the late 1800s, and Elmer Keith wrote for Guns and Ammo. I believe he was the handgun editor for Guns and Ammo back in the 60s. Well, there has never been a lack of press writers, you know, gun writers who will pontificate about what police officers need, what the law enforcement community needs. Typically, it comes from, frankly, not knowing any better, and perhaps not knowing many police officers. I can relate back to a video I did earlier, you know, how to choose a defensive handgun, and I spoke about this. Police officers are not gun aficionados, as a lot. They certainly are not. I would go so far as to say that in my experience as a professional police instructor of firearms throughout my entire career, that I ran into probably less than 1 out of 20 people who came on the job understanding what a handgun was or had even seen one. That ranks at it's far less than 1 in 10. It'd be more like probably 1 in 20 that had any familiarity whatsoever with a handgun. And of those that had some familiarity with a handgun, probably only 1 in 5 of them had any serious familiarity with a handgun. Most of them had only fired maybe their dad's handgun before or something like that, or they knew of their uncle owning a particular handgun and maybe had you know, shot it a couple of times. But police officers are not, as a lot, handgun aficionados. They're not firearms aficionados at all. They're chosen for the profession for reasons that transcend anything to do with firearms. They're chosen because, first of all, they have to pass a psychological test. They have to pass agility tests. They certainly have to pass drug tests. And there's all the tests that they have to pass are generally not the ones that can be passed by those who have. This is a cultural thing, it's an aberration that I can't explain, but you know, those who have an awful lot of familiarity with firearms for some reason don't seek work in the police profession. They have to seek the work. It's not necessarily that they're not qualified, but they have to seek employment with it. So they don't generally tend to be the people who knock on the door to become police officers. Benny, he's a good boy. So in their pontification about what police officers need, It was their conclusion, Duke Roberts and Elmer Keith, that what the police officer needed was a handgun round that was just a little bit more powerful and more formidable than the .357 Magnum, which, by the way, was not being resoundingly accepted by most police departments in this country, and for reasons I've talked about before and I'll talk about again. And the .44 Magnum being too powerful. Now I've got the .44 Magnum here and the .357 Magnum. Here's the .44 and here's the .357 right here. Now the .44 Magnum has a case length of 1.285 nominally, and the .357 Magnum is actually slightly longer by 5/1000 of an inch at 1.290 in length. Now that's nominal length. You know, you don't go measuring your own cases and telling me that's different, because oftentimes they're factory trimmed a little bit shorter so that they can be sure that they won't be overly long. The difference between the .357 and the .44 Magnum is smaller than their names suggest. The .357 Magnum is a true .357 Magnum, measured from groove to groove, across the groove diameter. In other words, the bullet diameter is a true .357 in diameter. The .44 Magnum is actually a true .43. It's a .430 diameter bullet nominally. And the reason I've been asked this before, why is a .357 and a .38 the same diameter bullet? Well, that's because the tradition in years past was to name a handgun cartridge oftentimes by its case, I should say its chamber diameter, which is slightly larger than the case diameter because of the expansion issues. So a .38 Special was named for its chamber dimension, its chamber diameter, whereas it fires a .357 diameter bullet. So a .38 Special is basically a foreshortened version of a .357 Magnum, or actually historically it's the other way around. It's the .357 came out, I believe, in 1935, and the .38 Special came out in 1902. So there's a difference there of not too many years. So just basically 33 years between the two, which makes them relatively newcomers on the market when you think about it, because the .45 Colt has been around longer, and the .44-40 was around longer, and things like that. So they're fairly newcomers. The .44 Magnum with its 4.430 bullet, and some bullets are, you know, .427, .429, .428. There's different variations, but that's the actual diameter of the grooves, the groove dimension. The bore, remember, is bored out first before they had hammer forged barrels. The bore was drilled out first, which left the top of the lands, and then the grooves were cut out or broached afterwards. So anyway, I digress. The .41 Magnum is a true .41 diameter bullet, and it was actually when it was released in 1964 by Remington. The cartridge was actually the first one to ever use a true .41 caliber bullet. There was actually a true .41, a couple of true .41s back in around the 1860s or so, and a .41 Derringer and things like that. They used a true .41 bullet, but like the .41 Long Colt was actually is a .388 diameter bullet. It was not really a .41. And the .38-40 was, I believe, that was a .40 caliber bullet, if I'm not mistaken. So there's names are oftentimes very misleading. But what happened to the .41 Magnum, which has basically caused it to draw a lot of yawns and derision. Actually, it's been derided by a lot of writers. What has caused that is a multitude of things that all collided as a perfect storm against it. You know, it's been fighting for its life really since its beginning. And to be honest with you, I think for a period of about 20 years or more, I wasn't sure whether it was going to survive at all. I think ammo existed on the shelf, and I think for a while Smith & Wesson stopped producing firearms for it. Ruger has stopped producing some firearms for it. It's bubbling back again, and for good reason. I think it ought to be a lot more popular than it is. And let me explain. Its power level is probably understated. It has slightly greater penetration, even though it has a little bit smaller sectional, lighter, I should say, a less sectional density than the standard 240 grain bullet in the 44 Magnum. The 210 grain bullet in the 41 Magnum typically has greater penetration in most tissue, or in, you know, even if it's tested in pine boards. The 41 will usually penetrate one more pine board than the 44, despite the fact that it has somewhat less sectional density. Well, part of that is because it has slightly greater velocity. Its velocity is probably on average 50 to 60 or 70 feet per second greater. It's a little bit more speedy. And its smaller diameter also provides a little bit less surface friction trying to get through materials. So it has that advantage of somewhat greater penetration. But at the same time, it has 25%, and that's a lot, 25% less recoil than the 44 Magnum. So at about the time that when the 41 Magnum was being offered to the public, Keith and Roberts both were purporting it to be the next, best thing for the American police officer. That the handgunning police officer was going to be absolutely thrilled by this gun. It was going to solve all his problems for power, and he wouldn't have to cower in the corner anymore. I mean, they wrote it's ridiculous prose. They wrote things that really were not germane to the police officer. Police officers have to carry around a lot of crap with them. They have to carry handcuffs. They wear a big heavy Sam Browne belt that doesn't bend very well at the waist. They carry radios. Of course, back in 1964, 65, a lot of police officers were walking beats, didn't carry radios. They just simply, like I did when I first came on, you carried a box key and you rang the box. And sometimes you didn't always get a radio to walk around with. So, but just despite that, police officers were heavily encumbered with stuff. The clothing of the day, we didn't, back in those days, you didn't wear body armor. It hadn't been introduced, it hadn't been invented yet. But back in the 60s, police officers were still, if you worked in the northern climates, in the Northeast and stuff, you were still wearing what they called, in the wintertime, you wore the horse blanket. It was a coat that it was double-breasted, so it was double thickness of wool that went all the way up. If you can imagine wearing a double-breasted pea coat that doesn't come down to your pockets, but it comes all the way down below your knees. That was called the horse blanket, and it was very heavy. And when that got wet, it was all the more cumbersome. So you wore things like that. Police officers didn't leave the station thinking that they were going to get into gun battles in those days. It was quite rare. Most of the gun battles were taking place amongst the bad people. The La Costa Nostra were wiping out each other and things like that. Police officers would, find dead bodies in trunks of cars and everything shot up underneath a bridge or something that, in Boston and New York, but and in Rhode Island. But it was not something the police officer really, despite the writings of so many of these authors, police officers were not being, they were not finding themselves in too many gun battles. So the idea of carrying around something that was more formidable than 38 Special that they carried, and which they didn't train with, in those days police officers didn't receive what you call training. There was no regulated, regimented training of any sort until police departments like LAPD and things started getting, sued by the public because of stray bullets that would strike and things like that. So, once vicarious liability started to come onto the scene in the late 60s and early 70s, that training started to change, and that's where I came into the scene. I was really the first, firearms instructor in probably in my entire, well, certainly in our department. And throughout the entire state, you didn't have too many actual firearms instructors. You had people who were familiar with firearms that the chief would call upon, and maybe it was the chief himself who would call upon to, give informal instruction to their officers and maybe to so-called qualify them, making sure that they could shoot the gun, without dropping the bullets on the ground or something. It was not the scene that it is today. So you have to suspend reality when you're talking about police training as it was back in 1964 and 1965. There was no such thing as police training. There were very few academies, unless you went to a state police academy or something like that. Most of the time, police officers simply were placed. They were placed on the job. They were given a gun and a badge, and maybe the sergeant took them out to the back lot, and they fired off a few rounds, and if you could hit a 55-gallon drum from 15 paces away, he'd go back to the chief and say, "Chief, he's qualified. He's all set. He can carry it." And I told him all the rules. So things were far different then, and this is the market that Roberts and Keith were speaking to. No police officer or police administrator had any interest whatsoever in carrying around something that was far heavier. When the Model 57 41 Magnum came out, it came out in that's an end-frame gun. The end-frame gun is markedly heavier and bigger and bulkier than the K-frame Model 10 38 M&P that most police officers were carrying at the time. A lot of departments were carrying around the standard weight barrel. Didn't even want to bother with the heavy barrel model, the so-called heavy barrel Model 10 M&P. So lightness was always something which a police officer preferred. Something not only was light, but something wouldn't get hung up on the steering wheel when he was trying to alight from the vehicle. You can't just say you want to have something bigger and heavier when you really can't deal with it. You had to ride around the car. You have to somehow or another, you are its companion for the day. That thing is sticking into the seat all day long, and it can be very uncomfortable after a while. But you certainly can't deal with something that's even bigger and heavier, with a bigger holster, and requires several more ounces that you have to carry around, plus heavier bullets too. So it immediately fell on deaf ears. I know that it was. I know that there was a heavy push to try to seduce certain departments, especially in the Northeast, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Western Massachusetts, all the areas that were, a stone's throw from Springfield, Massachusetts, where Smith & Wesson resides on Roosevelt Avenue. Those departments were, presented with this, and they were pictures were taken with police officers, in uniform with their leather jackets and all that stuff, as being this is the ideal. They should be carrying this. And then right after the Model 57 came out in 1964, Smith & Wesson produced a so-called M&P model. It looked identical to the Smith & Wesson Model 10 M&P, but naturally it was built on an end frame rather than the smaller, lighter, easier to carry K-frame. Well, anyway, it never went anywhere with police departments. The second mistake that Remington made, and they still make to this day because it's not an undoable, it's certainly not an undoable mistake. They offered it in 2 loadings. Now, I'm not saying that it was offered in 2 different loadings like a 38 Special is offered and a 357 is offered and a 44 Special and a 44 Magnum is offered. It was offered in two distinctly different velocity levels and bullet designs in the same exact 41 Magnum case. So it was a 41 Magnum, regardless of what came out of it, it was a 41 Magnum head stamp. They didn't have a 41 Special. That, I think, was probably its greatest, that was Remington's greatest mistake of all. And if I would have talked to anybody at Remington or to Winchester or to whomever, if they would simply come out with a 41 Special, it would make it a very, very attractive proposition, just like the 357 and the 44 Magnum. They are very attractive because a person who has either can buy the Special version, the shorter, lighter recoiling load that is something that they can shoot and practice and plink with, maybe go small game hunting with or something like that, without having to deal with the heavy blast, muzzle blast, and the recoil of the Magnum versions. The 41 Magnum had a 210 grain lead bullet loading, which was so-called the police loading. It was not listed like that in the publications. This was something you had to be a reader of this material in order to understand that it was a so-called police loading. It was a 210 grain lead bullet, which was driven at normally 1,000 feet per second, versus the standard Magnum loading, which was driven at almost 1,600 feet per second. That's big difference in velocity and recoil was something that most people didn't know anything about. All they knew was that there was a 41 Magnum. And if you went to the store and you bought 41 Magnum loads, most people didn't know that there were 2 loadings for it. They didn't know that maybe they would ask for the lead bullet load because it was cheaper. And so they'd buy that and they'd shoot it, and then they'd go to the store the next time and the clerk would give them the ones with the jacketed bullets, and all of a sudden now the gun flies out of their hand because they're not expecting something like that. It was a very confusing situation, and it remains so today. It should not be a 41 Magnum light loading and a 41 Magnum heavy loading. That's not even sensible. Magnum, by its very definition, means heavier power. That's what the whole point is. So it's not something which was ever very logical. If they would just simply reduce the size of that case and come out with a special version, then you would have a viable so-called 41 Special load and market as such. That leads to the great confusion with the case. Now let me talk about the fantastic advantage that it has. I alluded to this. It has a 25% reduction in recoil from the 240 grain load of the 44 Magnum. That's no small amount, you know. And I can speak as a person who fired his first Magnum handgun load with a it was not my dad's 357 Magnum Python. In fact, he had it at the time. I had watched him shoot the 357 Magnum loads, and I had out of the Python, and I had shot quite a number of the 38 Special loads, especially target, wad cutter loads, at the range from that gun. But I had never shot any of the 357 Magnum loads. Most of them were given to him by a friend that was doing some loading for him, and so he had a precious few that he would shoot on occasion. My first actual Magnum handgun was that I fired was in 1965. My dad acquired a Blackhawk, Ruger Blackhawk in .41 Magnum, and he never shot the lead bullet loads because he wanted to have the Magnum loadings. So I think the second cylinder he loaded up, he let me shoot it, and I wasn't probably more than 110 pounds soaking wet at the time. I was just a scrawny kid, a really skinny kid, and I was only in my not even 15 yet. And when I fired, in fact, I think it was probably about 14. When I fired that gun, no, I guess I would have had to be about 15. When I fired that gun, I said, gee, that's not so bad. And I was wearing big David Clark green, hearing protectors, the same kind of big bulbous things that they wear on aircraft carriers, that the crews wear to protect their hearing. So the bark was, I didn't hear the noise going off, and the shriek or anything, and it was actually quite pleasant. I didn't find it at all distasteful. In that Blackhawk with the rounded back strap, it just rolled back in my hand, in my skinny hand, but I had big hands, and it just rolled back in my hand and it recoiled, and I thought it was quite pleasant to shoot. I fired all 6 off, and I think through the years I fired quite a number of rounds of that, and I found it very, very easy to shoot, and I could shoot it quite accurately. Now I can't say that about the .44 Magnum the first time I touched one off. A few years later, when I fired my first .44 Magnum, I was startled, really startled by the significantly different recoil. Really hurt, it stung. It was a Model 29, which brings me to the paradox that the .41 Magnum lives in, and what it was up against. The .44 Magnum, when it first came out, it basically stayed fairly obscure. For many years, it was notorious for being a punishing gun that had heavy recoil, heavy muzzle blast, and those David Clark earmuffs that I spoke of, that was not something that most people wore. Very few people wore hearing protection. They would just, roll up cotton balls and stick in their ears or something, or maybe they'd stick cigarette filters in their ears if they did anything, and they just shot like that. That was, all you have to do is you can look at some of these old magazines back from the 50s and 60s if you can find it, and you can see people shooting these big cannons, all kinds of stuff, rifles, and no matter what it was, they were shooting it without any ear protection whatsoever. So the .44 Magnum was considered to be a very painful gun in all ways to shoot. And its recoil was something that was handled. In fact, John T. Amber, who wrote, the Gun Digest, who was the editor for Gun Digest for many years, he classified the gun as being a cartridge for the veteran handgunner. So it was something that most people shied from. But then along came Clint Eastwood in his Dirty Harry movies in the mid-70s. Well, that caused immediately a change in the atmosphere surrounding the .44 Magnum. Overnight, the .44 Magnum became popular as ice cream, and it was one of those things that Smith & Wesson wasn't prepared for. They flew off the shelves. They couldn't make Model 29s fast enough. So the .44 Magnum suddenly, hit pay dirt, and for all those years that it languished through the 50s and 60s and into the beginning of the 70s, basically just dragging its heels. Now it was truly, something that everybody wanted to have. They wanted to have, like Clint Eastwood said in the movie, Dirty Harry said in the movie, the most powerful handgun in the world. So everybody had to have that. So that was the problem that the .41 Magnum came up against. Nobody wanted to have the second most powerful handgun in the world. Nobody likes to be second place. And so it immediately got a bad reputation as being neither here nor there. It was fish nor fowl. It was the term oftentimes expressed by gun writers. Rather than touting its advantage that it had significantly less recoil, being only 75% of the recoil of the .44 Magnum, was 25% less for the standard bullet weights. Rather than touting it for that and touting it as being the gun that can help out the average handgunner, they dismissed it, and they poison penned it to death, or they simply they killed it by virtue of ignoring it. They just didn't speak about it half the time. It got very little press, and what press it got was not necessarily attractive. So they didn't tout the .44 Magnum. I should say they didn't honestly represent the .44 Magnum many times as being what it was, a difficult gun to handle. Because gun writers, being what they are, it's very frequently they're promoting their own machismo themselves, and they don't want to say, well, this is a very difficult handgun to handle, and they're probably not willing to put that on paper because maybe that would be perceived that they were, weaklings. So the .44 Magnum became the darling of the industry in the handgun game. If you wanted something more powerful than the .357, you had to get a .44 Magnum, and the .41 Magnum was just not a player, and it still, unfortunately, remains that way. So it had a bad introduction. It was promoted as a police officer's handgun cartridge and police officer's handgun frame, which it never was, and it couldn't possibly be. For no sensible police officer wanted to carry that kind of weight around all day, and most police officers certainly couldn't handle that kind of recoil, because a lot of administrators simply didn't understand that there was a 1,000 foot per second load that had very light recoil. As a matter of fact, it was in that in-frame model. It actually produces about a pound, a little bit more than a pound, foot-pound less recoil than a .357 Magnum full house load in that same frame, and a little bit more, about another pound and a half more recoil than a 38 special, 158 grain 38 special load out of a K-frame. So it actually truly had a very, very good recoil level, but it was certainly not appropriate for any police officer or department to really consider. And even now, when you read so many magazine articles, or now it's not so much the magazine articles, but it's on YouTube, those who promote such notions not only don't understand the true needs of the working officer and trooper, but they sometimes they think that police officers can just go out and buy these things on their own and stick them in their own holster, and that's very, very few cases would that ever be permitted. With the liability issues that go on these days, even the smallest department have to have some sort of a guiding regulation. They have to have some standard by which the department in the city or the town pledges itself, and they just can't have police officers being renegades and buying whatever they want to buy and strap it on. It just doesn't work that way. So it's not a personal decision to just carry whatever handgun or whatever load you want to carry on duty all day long. That comes under scrutiny of the department, and with very few exceptions. Now, so it flunked out as a police load. It was inappropriately promoted as being a police load and a police gun. It was never promoted as being a handgunner's dream for the hunter, and that really bothers me, because I think that the .41 Magnum really got the short end of the stick on that regard, because it's probably more ideal than the .357 for the handgun hunter. it certainly has more diameter, and it's a more formidable deer hunting round than the 357. The 357 will take deer, but it's the 158 grain bullet, 165 grain bullet. They're a little on the light side for deer, and most of the loadings, unfortunately, are the bullet offerings are usually kind of frangible. So it's a little bit light for deer. The 41 Magnum is not light. With the proper bullet, it is a very, very formidable cartridge for deer, and without having that awful recoil and muzzle blast that the 44 has for so many people who quickly get rid of what they just bought. I mentioned before, when I was talking about the 44 Magnum in another video, the 44 Magnum is probably one of the most sold guns that people ever acquire. They buy them, and then they very shortly thereafter they fire the first half a box, and they can't stomach it anymore. And after it sits in their safe for a few months, they finally screw up the courage to bring it back to the store or sell it to their brother-in-law or something, because they just don't want to shoot it anymore, and they realize that they get this $1,000 handgun sitting there that they're just not going to shoot. So it's always been a gun that was never very popular. It didn't remain popular for the true handgun hunter, except for those who are as John T. Amber said. The late John T. Amber said, it's a veteran handgunner's round, and for those few people who don't mind shooting it, it's okay. But for the vast majority of people who buy it, they soon discover it's not their cup of tea, and so they go back to the 357 Magnum, or maybe they just eliminate that from all consideration. When in fact they might find that 41 Magnum, just like when I was a young kid, a lightweight kid, scrawny kid, I could handle the 41 Magnum without any difficulty whatsoever, and it didn't burn my hand, and it was very, very comfortable to control. So because it had a bigger frame, it's a very, very nice gun to shoot. So why don't I have a 41 Magnum? Well, it's a very good question. It's probably a matter of practicality. You see, when I was going to buy my first 44 Magnum a number of years ago, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, my buddy had just bought himself a Super Blackhawk Ruger in this might have been about 8 years ago or something, and he also had a companion piece, Marlin lever action rifle. So I figured, well, I could help load up ammo for him. So I acquired those dies, and I figured we're going to be on the same keel. So I also had a Super Blackhawk, and I think I showed you that Blackhawk in one of my videos. And so that's once you get all basically geared up for 44 Magnum, rather than going out and buying 41 Magnum dies and things like that, I just never got into the 41 Magnum thing. But I certainly consider it to be, a far more delightful gun to shoot, even with full house loads, than the 44 Magnum, and it has the capability of taking anything in my neighborhood, deer, and even those bear that come around too. So it's a great cartridge. I recommend it highly if you're at all considering a very worthy handgun hunting cartridge, one that can be used. Really, I consider it to be more flexible than the 357, because with the smaller loads, with the lighter loads, a handgun reloader, or even if you buy the 1,000 foot per second loads, I can't say that, I don't know for sure if they're still even being produced, but with lighter loads, it's a very, very easy gun to shoot, and it's a heavier frame gun. In its full house loads, it's a fabulous gun for deer and bear, and it has even taken elk within reasonable ranges. So it has virtually everything that the 44 Magnum has without having the punishing effects. So it's a great round, and I recommend it highly. Benny is doing very good. Benny, here. See if he's. Last I knew, he was trying to hide his big milk bone, his cookie. Benny, here. What's he doing? Oh, he's got his cookie. Yeah, here he is. Oh, he's wagging his tail. Oh, that's your cookie, huh? Oh, yeah. That's a good boy. Oh, he's a good boy. You don't want to be on TV today? No, once we give him his cookie, he'll spend half the day finding a place to hide that, and sometimes he's hiding it right out in the middle of the living room floor. If he thinks that you saw him put it there, he'll go and move it someplace else, because he's the only dog. You see a lot of cartoons of dogs burying bones. He actually buries bones. He takes his milk bone outside. One year he buried his milk bone out in the side yard, and at that time we had the truckload of wood, 4 cords of wood dumped on top of where he buried it, and so 2.5 months later, when we cleared out all the wood and brought it in, he dug up his milk bone. It was the grossest looking thing you ever saw. We wouldn't let him in the house, but it was all moldy, and he ate it. So it was he's a character, but we love him so much. But again, consider the 41 Magnum if you're looking for a good hunting round. It's a fantastic round. It's certainly not a police officer's round, and it never should have been promoted that way. And I'm not one to give it short shrift. I'm here to speak the truth about it. It's a great handgun round. I'll tell you how great it is on a comparative basis. The 10 millimeter Smith & Wesson has been promoted as being one of the so-called, by many circles, it's considered one of the most ideal handgun hunting rounds there ever was. Well, the 41 Magnum uses essentially the same diameter bullet and at a higher velocity. So it's whatever the 10 millimeter is, the 41 Magnum beats it. So it's all the better. And not only that, but it's in a better platform. Automatics don't lend themselves well. I've spoken about this. Semi-automatics don't lend themselves well to the field shooter because they spew that expensive brass is being thrown out into the brush and out into a meadow someplace into tall grass. You're not going to find it. And that's not the way I like to treat my handgun brass. It's a lot nicer to have a revolver so that you can keep those precious pieces of metal afterwards and put them in your pocket. So and plus there's something about a revolver that just seems to be a little bit more friendly to the hunting scene. They're not so prone to freezing up in cold weather and things like that. They don't have issues. So they're very, 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 very friendly for the handgun hunter. So that's all I have to say, and I'm sticking to it. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and stay safe. Pray for those who are affected by this coronavirus right now. We're doing that every day. And pray that it goes away soon. We don't need this around. It's really hurting our country and hurting throughout the world. But when you subscribe, don't forget to hit the bell there so you can get your notifications so that when I launch a new video, you'll know about it. So thank you for watching. Thank you for praying, and God bless.